know the why human trafficking work is needed: to fight for the freedom of modern-day slaves. But love, passion, commitment isn't all you need to be an effective and successful anti-trafficking advocate. Learn the how. I'm Dr. Celia Williamson, Director of the Human Trafficking and Social Justice Institute at the University of Toledo. Welcome to the Emancipation Nation podcast, where I'll provide you with the latest and best methods, policy, and practice discussed by experienced experts in the field so that you can cut through the noise, save time, and be about the work of saving lives. Welcome to the Emancipation Nation, episode 203. I'm Dr. Celia Williamson, and today I wanted to give you sort of a glimpse of an important discussion going on around the world. Today we have the Global Association of Human Trafficking Scholars. These are researchers from around the world, and we are engaged in a discussion about language and the importance of language and how people identify themselves and how they identify their experiences. And, we tend to think we might know how people identify themselves in terms of sex trafficking or labor trafficking or being in the sex trade, not even trafficking. And we might profess to know their experience because we've been to several workshops, or we've listened to perhaps all these podcasts. And what the researchers, what the scholars, the people who build knowledge say is that we don't necessarily know. We have to allow people to describe their experiences based on their own histories, and they have to identify themselves accordingly. So listen to the discussion. I think it's going to be a good one. The discussion is being led by Jared Davis and Dr. Glenn Miles. And Jared briefly describes his experience. Dr. Glenn doesn't really talk about his experience as a researcher, so I want to give you a little bit of a better idea about who these two guys are. Jared Davis has 15 years experience designing and conducting evidence-based research and also programming for children and vulnerable people that have experienced sexual exploitation and violence. So he's been involved in special projects on harmful sexual behavior among children in Cambodia, street working children in the Philippines, Cambodia, Thailand, and children and young people who trade sex in a range of nations. So most of his work has developed in post-colonial settings, often at the intersection of race, class, gender, and sexuality. So he really tries to look at all sides, not just one-dimensional. He also has expertise in exploitation and violence involving boys and young men. So critical to that, because we don't have a lot of discussion and a lot of research in that area. He also involves himself in a lot of participatory research, children's participation in research, trauma-informed research, participant action research, that sort of getting the subjects of the research also participating in designing and carrying out the research. So Dr. Glenn Miles, he's a research associate at Oxford Center on Mission Studies, and he's a senior researcher with UP International. He has 30 years experience focused on child abuse and exploitation in Southeast Asia. He's a pioneer, and he's led several international NGOs and projects in Cambodia. And he's facilitated a series of research projects listening to survivors of sexual exploitation, both prostituted men, women, boys, girls, and transgenders. Also, sex buyers who are males. He's an academic And again, that level of expertise with the sexual exploitation of boys and transgenders, also LGBT youth, children who are trafficked across borders, longitudinal research between research over long periods of time, addressing demand, pornography in youth. So these two guys are well qualified to lead this discussion about language, about how people identify, and about the unique experiences that should be defined by them, and they should be empowered to do so and to be involved in the discussion, in the knowledge making. So without further ado, here is the discussion.
Okay, so for this month's dialogue, we are focusing on neutrality and language and terminology in research. So we have two of our GATS senior research scholars, Jarrett Davis and Glenn Miles, who are joining us today to help lead the conversations, give their thoughts, and kind of provide some questions for us all to think about and get the conversations going. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jarrett if he wants to introduce himself a little bit more and maybe introduce the topic. So again, thank you all for being here.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I think probably maybe half of you. For those of you I haven't met, welcome. For those of you that are first time, it's good to have you here. I'm Jarrett Davis. I'm a social researcher, consultant. I've worked with Glenn for a lot of my career, but usually with a network of child protection organizations, mostly in Asia. Glenn and I have worked together in developing a number of series of studies on children in uniquely vulnerable contexts, so particularly boys, young men, street working children, children who trade sex, and so on. But that's me. And Glenn.
Yeah, you said it, Jarrett. I think that's fine.
So anyway, we really wanted to as you'll see on the screen here, we've kind of wanted to open this up and so that we can talk a little bit more on what you all are specifically working with. But we kind of wanted to open up this discussion. One thing that really popped into my mind was in talking about neutrality and terminology is sort of this tension between neutrality and political correctness. So, and this is something that's talked about a lot. We have a lot of talk in the media about language usage. There's a lot of people that get canceled. There's a lot of all of this stuff. But I wanted to talk because how do you specifically navigate that tension between using neutral language that doesn't judge or condemn or stigmatize in any way, but also language that appropriately describes a reality in a way that is neutral, but is that is neutral, but that also respects people. So we kind of wanted to play with some of those tensions. Where did we want to start, Glenn?
Yeah, well, before we go any further, is there any issues that people are burning to talk about during this session, or are we just going to see how it flows? Anybody got anything they want to say particularly? Okay, well, we'll take that as a no. So one of the things that we talked a little bit about, Jarrett and I, was just, some of the language that we use when we're talking about survivors. It may be appropriate in some contexts and not appropriate in others. And actually asking survivors themselves what they prefer the terms to be used is actually really important. So, for example, some people might prefer to be known as survivors, others as victims. Some might prefer to be called prostitutes. Others prefer to be called a prostituted person. Tell us about things in your context where where terms have been are different and may feel uncomfortable to one group, but actually it's something which people are used to being called. Another one I'm thinking of is in Southeast Asia. People often didn't like us using the term ladyboy, but actually it was the term that they themselves used. So it's another one of those examples where it's different, but it's like,
for instance, in that when we were,
the important thing is what people themselves want. So
yeah.
can people think of other examples of where that's been in their context?
One of the tricky things with us, the thing that Glenn started to mention there with the in Bangkok and in Cambodia, is that one of the big pushbacks that we got was that we weren't using, at the time it was the operating term was transgender male or transgender female. Non-binary, there were some of those terms were still being thrown around, but what we had found was that this was a subgroup, really a subgroup that had its own identity, and people that identified and saw themselves and as ladyboys and protected that ladyboy identity. And it wasn't a trans man or a trans woman or a Western concept of non-binary, but it was something else that was defined within the culture. And in order to talk about some of the unique vulnerabilities that group experiences, we have to define that as a group using their language and respecting that as an identity. So that's kind of where we kind of came from in ours, if that kind of helps a little bit.
Yeah, I saw that John and William did unmute. Or John, did you have something that you wanted to share in regards to that?
No, I was just thinking about the work that we're doing, and mostly the way we get our information is we have a survivors council. That's how they chose to name themselves, but some of them name themselves as lived experience experts. And so it's, the challenge is, if you're working with these groups, at least from where I sit, and my work is all right now within the United States, although we're starting to deal with stuff that's coming into the United States, and groups have come into the United States. So we're going to find, it's not unlikely that we will find groups that identify differently. And how do we deal with that? And I don't have an answer. I just know that the way I'm trying to address it is working with individuals who have lived that experience and what is the language they want to use. And so in our research, we're going out and reaching out to organizations that may be interacting with them, like transit agencies or airports or that sort of stuff. And what is it that they're going to how are they going to be identifying these individuals who may be trafficked and may wish to find an alternative way to live, or may not? And how do we identify the traffickers? And so we're looking at, in one instance, one project, at the technologies that might be used. And how can those technologies be used to help people who are potentially out there to help individuals who do not want to be in that position? Identify them and help them out if they want out. And I think that, so I don't have an answer. All I know is that it's a challenging issue. And so the way we try to address it is working with people who identify themselves, whether they want to be called a survivor, or they want to be called a lived experience expert, or not many want to be called victims anymore. And do they want to be called someone who's moving out and becoming, I mean, I even hear people talking about being thrivers. And so, well, what does thriving mean? I mean, I think that's an interesting term.
It is.
Because not everybody in this society who's never been a victim considers himself a thriver either. So it's I think there are interesting challenges here.
Are any of us thriving?
Yeah, or any of us thriving? That's a really open.
Have we set ourselves up with a society that can ensure that people thrive? Because
Right.
Right. I yeah. Yeah. Can't remember where I was going with that. Yeah, but continue. Anyone else?
I wanted to mention that another word that has just come into my mind when the discussion started, and this is sex industry. The thin line between a crime and when we talk about an industry, something that people do to earn money or maybe do some business and that kind of a thing. And then two things right now in my mind about when we are talking about these terms: victims, sex industry, or whatever term people may use, prostitutes. The whole idea of human dignity and also context. And I think those are two critical things that kind of just, I feel like they're good. It's good to think about that when we kind of talking about these terms. And just when we talk about human dignity, it's kind of recognizing that people are human before they are anything else. Before they are victims or whatever. Those are the terms that we use. We can kind of just know that they are human. And I remember, I come from Kenya, and when I remember when AIDS was killing people in back in the days, people are being termed as victims. And but that improved with time, and it became people living with HIV and AIDS. And I thought that was a little bit of a neutral term, because we recognize their dignity, we recognize that they are human first, and then they have this kind of a problem, or they are affected by this kind of a problem. So yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think that conversation, comes back to it can be applied very well to sexuality, to gender, to a lot of this. We've just finished this research in Minnesota looking at the experiences of boys and young men who are seeking services for sexual abuse and exploitation. And we find that a lot of most responses, most offices, whether it be government, nonprofit, despite them having attempts to be inclusive, and maybe that they use language like, for all children or things like that, but we find that in reality, it's that we have a child protection system that is sort of, you have the boy package and you have the girl package, and those are it's like you have two options basically, and both options are built on a presumed construct of what a boy needs and what a girl needs, and those are the two options. Now, in the way it's usually set up, the what the boy needs, that is usually very, very underfunded, and there's hardly anything there, very not connected very much. And then you also often have a lot of survivor services that are, lots of things, often reduplicated services over here that might be trying to meet a perceived need of what a girl, as defined by the funders or donors, what they need. But what we find is that we're starting with gender, we're starting with those considerations rather than starting with a child or a young person or a young adult or a vulnerable person who has had experiences. And then realizing that their gender and how they've been packaged by their society and by the definitions that have been assigned to them, that's a part of their experiences too. So like that, I mean, that's just kind of, it's a conversation that we've been having, that it seems that a lot of our systems start with, well, is it A or B? And then we'll figure out what services, rather than saying, okay, it's a person who has a complex web of needs. And there might be bits of different things that they need, if that's helpful. But I see that exactly applying all around this.
I think it's interesting that it was as long ago as 1989 when the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was launched, and also that it was agreed to by so many countries around the world. And child participation was a major part of that. Children having a voice in what they can, that are things that they, how can I put this, are things that impacted them, that they should have a voice in that. And in one sense, that's now what we're saying about survivors of all ages, that they should all have an opportunity to be involved in decisions that are being made about them. And I think when we put their voices high up on the agenda, then we're less likely to make a mistake when it comes to neutrality, because we're treating them as equal at some level. We're saying they have something valuable to contribute to this discussion. In fact, they have a right to have that.
Well, I mean, I really like the direction this is going, but I'm thinking about another group of people who are trafficked in their labor. And how do we address that?
Labor trafficking?
Yeah, because in one of my projects is to look at all forms of trafficking. So it's both sex, it's labor, it is people who are pressed into service in the military, who are young children, it's forced marriage.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because I feel like, especially within the United States, a lot of the language that we use is geared towards sex trafficking. And most of the times, even when I am talking to people in the community, when they say human trafficking, they really just mean sex trafficking. So yeah, thinking about the language that we use, or how our society is just when they say human trafficking means sex trafficking, whether that's because of media or it's a lot to do with funding and programming as well. So I think that's a great point.
Yeah, and they're not mutually exclusive.
Right.
No,
yeah.
Exactly.
Also, I think that there's an awareness, isn't there, recently, of things like kids that are being forced to do sports in order that they're so that for their country, for their families, so that to the point where they don't really have any choice. And so they may well be on the path to success, but at what cost, and how much rights do they actually have to decide what's happening? And also, again, that those we know from several incidents where there's the crossover there between elite sport and sexual abuse.
I think one of the things that I see that trips me up, trips a lot of people up, I feel is the fact that there's so many experiences are different, because so many identities are different, because so many the perception of people are different. Person A and person B can have the same exact experiences, but have completely opposite outcomes depending upon their experiences prior to that point, right? And so we often try to find language that describes an experience of a person, but we're often missing the kind of the golden thread. For me, I think focusing on experience. Sometimes it sounds a little weird in at least when I'm writing research. I I found it just to talk about people who have experiences that are exploitive. When you talk about experiences, then you can talk about power and control. You can talk about, because ultimately in every one of these situations, really we're talking about consent, coercion, power, control. We're talking about dynamics. And all of that is contingent upon the identities that people hold for themselves, where they place themselves against other people, whether they feel that they can respond, whether they feel that are we even talking about this in the right way? I mean, I guess maybe that's one of the questions.
It kind of raises an interesting point, Jared, because I've been working with a couple of people, one who considers herself a lived experience expert, and another considers herself a survivor, and some others. And both of those individuals, it's a particular kind of situation in some senses, but both of those individuals came out of an environment in which they didn't see themselves as having options. They didn't see that there was another world in which they could be a participant. That it was the world in which they were brought up. And I can think now not of because I've done work with people who've been straight out criminals who grew up in that world. That was the world in which they grew up, so that was the norm. The rest of us were stupid for working because a hell of a lot easier to go steal something.
Yeah.
And the price was not the price, and their dad, their mother, their father, their uncle, whatever. It was all part of the game. It was who they were. And how do we address that? Because I'm aware of families where grandmothers were trafficked and the mothers were trafficked and the daughters are trafficked, and it's all generational.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when we talk about this, we're putting our own construct on this kind of thing in our own way.
Totally.
But on the other hand, we don't have a real option if we're going to try to address the issue.
No, and often that's one of the things, coming back to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, was it did create a common language that could be used by everybody. So then we would understand what each other was talking about when we talked about different types of abuse and exploitation, for example. So, and that's been refined by different, like the Palermo Protocol and things like that. But I think that's a really good point. Yeah. One thing that I feel is, I feel it would be good for us to explore a bit more, because Williams here in particular is where it gets really dangerous for people to talk. William, do you want to just briefly explain your context in Kenya and what's going on there, and why it's really important for us to be aware of it?
Do you want me to talk specifically about the sex industry, what's the so-called sex industry or sex trafficking?
Sure.
Okay, let me say that I'm doing a research right now, working on children participation in social change. So when Dr. Glenn talks about child participation, that's my area of research right now, and primarily I'm looking at the role of children agency in anti-child sex trafficking advocacy. My research context is the coastal part of Kenya, Mombasa. Mombasa is an island right in the coastal part of Kenya, and then we have several other places around there, several other counties around there, Kilifi, Kwale, and And my interest in that, why I did this was I was working as a nonprofit director, dealing with a child sponsorship program. I was kind of in charge of a child sponsorship program that was in education, healthcare, and socioeconomic empowerment, and also faith development. And I happen to be in the coastal part of Kenya. Well, I don't really come from there, but I just went there for work. And as I was working there, there were I met with a lot of stories of child sex exploitation. I take child sex exploitation as a little bit of a kind of a bracket term, because under that we've kind of just have, trafficking, and now we have all these other forms of trafficking, just like I think John has highlighted, and all those ones are there: labor, forced marriage, sex, and even begging in the streets. So all those kind of things are there. Those different forms. But the stories were really hard to me, and so but then I witnessed something else unique, and this was something beautiful. There were a team of young teenagers between the age of, I think, 13 to 17. And I think they also had a few other elders, some few people kind of were mentoring them. And what they were doing was they were coming up with, they're using music and ideally performing arts to kind of voice out the challenge of child sex trafficking. And they were packaging terms and packaging music, and then going out there to engage a culture which was really encouraging child sex exploitation. And I would say the culture was encouraging because it's a kind of a culture which, in that particular area, which is involves celebration of the dead. When someone dies, people come together to celebrate and also to mourn, and then they bury the dead, and that takes a while. That may take like 5 days. And during that time, everybody stops. Everything stops in the village. And people just come together to the home of the deceased, and their job is kind of just to mourn. But then I would say a lot of other people, especially business people, take advantage of that. And there's a lot of music which is kind of just displayed there for free, and kids come because it's a communal setup. Everybody comes. And in that kind of a situation, now kids are easily preyed out, either for marriage or abused, or there are arrangements going on there to kind of traffic them and take them away. And especially because these activities take place during the night. So back to the small group of young teenagers. So these ones were coming up with a kind of a different approach. I think from a cultural anthropology point of view, I think they were bringing in what I may term as a functional substitute, whereby they bring in something into the culture using the same tools of the culture, music and performance, and then they package it in a way that engages that culture in a way to address or maybe to discourage sex exploitation for kids. And these were the kids doing that. So that kind of really struck me to want to research more what opportunities are there, what potentials are there for children to engage in anti-child sex trafficking advocacy. And I'm digging deep into that, kind of just trying to see not just music and performing arts, but also symbols and rituals that could also be incorporated into the work of advocacy by children to engage in anti-child sex trafficking. So that's kind of just my research. I thought just sharing my research would give you kind of like what is happening in Kenya and what I'm trying to do. Glenn, is there something specific you want me to touch about? I know we are talking about terminologies, we're talking about language, and maybe you can mention this. I know the UN Charter on child issues of child participation, issues of children rights. I know it has the definition of children as people below the age of 18. But in my context, that definition doesn't seem to work in that particular context. In fact, I would say the definition of a child is it's more of a sociological issue in that particular context. I'm saying this because we have people who are 15, 16, 17, and they are mothers. They have about 2-3 kids, and they are mothers, and they are considered mothers in that particular society because, of course, they got married off when they were young and that kind of a thing, and then they are no longer treated as children anymore. Though age-wise, they are still young, they are still below 18, but the society doesn't see them as kids.
Their
So
brains
there are
are
those kind of things. Yes. So maybe I can stop at that, and probably, yeah, we can engage more. Glenn, did you want me to say more, or do you have a question?
No, I think it's really, really good. But I think one of the things I wanted to say was, this is a group of victims who are trying to have a voice, but they're actually, and they understand that this is actually a really difficult thing to do, because it's because of because children's voices are not really valued to start with, but also because there's people at different higher levels who are going to make it very difficult for them if they expose what's going on, and so they're thinking of this creative way of using song to give themselves voices.
Upset a power structure.
Yes, to upset. I mean, it's a phenomenal idea. I just think I just wanted people to hear so that they could see what an impressive thing that you're trying to work with there. And I mean, it almost makes this kind of look at neutrality a bit silly, really.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's like this when you get down to the real stuff, it's just this is hard.
Struck by William's discussion of music and art, because they're languages.
Mm-hmm.
And we're now, and it's a different kind of language. It's a visual language and an oral language. And the visual language is multidimensional. And the oral language, and what we're using here with all this stuff is a string language. And we're trying to look at how to relate to these things that are multidimensional. And I was just in Chicago this past week on one of my projects, and I was out at Midway, which is the gateway for a lot of this stuff. They may not recognize it, but it is. But in any event, so my colleague and I were walking through from the transit operation over to the terminal. And there was art that was there. And we both triggered on there's no kids' art about exploitation. And yet and kids do express themselves in art about exploitation. And there's a whole area in psychology which use sand trays with kids so kids can portray things that they can't articulate. And how do we bring that in? I don't know the answer. It's just it just triggered off this whole other domain that we're really not talking about when we think about this stuff and ways to get at it.
Yeah.
I really like that, using it as a language, John. That's great.
Yeah.
Another form of language.
Yeah. I mean, I really think that being able to get down to, I think about this sort of in anthropological terms where, you have like values, and then you have beliefs, and then you have like practices, and you have, just this like layer. And I keep thinking, how do we describe, how do we sort of, like, we fight with this all the time, trying to figure out how do we describe, like, for instance, in a survey or in a protocol, if we're going to be having conversations with young people, how do we use language that describes the phenomenon of not being able to say no, and needing to do, whether it be labor or something where there is a threat, but because mom is saying to do it, or because dad is saying to do it, well, it's okay. That's what we see in familial exploitation, what we see in trafficking in athletics. It's their family members and their exploitation of those hierarchies that are kind of unwritten within families. How can we then describe these phenomena using words that actually articulate that experience, rather than applying a label which requires a prior understanding of what abuse is, or what exploitation is, or what trafficking is, or because ultimately, when we're looking at experiences, we're like you said, it's multifaceted, it's multidimensional, and it's not something that I feel like we need to get a lot better at communicating that phenomenon and beyond pre-existing legal terminology of what things are. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm making sense, or if I'm way too abstract.
I mean, I think that makes sense, Jared. And I think, I don't know, it also points to the importance of qualitative research and letting victims explain things in their own words, instead of us using terms or boxes for them to fit into, but for them to describe something in their own words. But, the bigger abstract thing of it is, do we even have those words that they can, describe their experience? But with what we have, that's, I think that points to the importance of qualitative research and doing those interviews and letting survivors have their voice to speak about their experience.
I mean, honestly, that's where nuance comes from, because that's where because in many ways, I think, because of how we think in terms of funding, we think in terms of generalizations and what's needed to establish policies and things like that.
I mean, I think this is really interesting, because at some level, we are all talking about trying to develop policy that helps us address things, and that ends up turning into statutory structures and all that sort of stuff. And yet, when you get down to the street level, so to speak, that's a domain that has almost, other than negative, almost no meaning to people who are within that world. And finding ways to translate from the world in which they're living and operating, in the world in which they come out of, into things which can be meaningful for them, requires us to figure out how to do the translation of languages. And so I'm just thinking now, again, to go back to the thinking about music and art. How do we take what we learn from someone's expressing themselves in music and art and turn it into something which allows us to develop policy to help them at that level? Because if we're going to try to go back up to where you were with, Jared, if we're talking about people who are going to make policy and decisions about how to fund, how to support, whatever the case may be, in some way we have to make the translation from the language that's meaningful to the people involved in that world into a language which the people who are going to be making policy can understand and comprehend and say, yeah, that's as meaningful as not. I mean, so, to go to the comment about qualitative work, the reality of it is that when we get to this point where we're talking about how are we going to help people make decisions, they're not looking at it qualitatively, because the only metric that they have is money and benefit. And how do you calculate the benefit stream?
Right.
And so how do you calculate the values of those stakeholders who are at different very different places in this world.
Yeah.
And so, we're trying to do that in a project that I'm on right now, in which we're looking at a whole new analytical model to be able to capture the values of different stakeholders.
Oh, that's great.
And raise the values of those people who are at the bottom of the food chain, so to speak, such that we understand what that value to them is, if we can do a better job of addressing the problems that they are confronting.
Exactly.
And what that value is to society. I don't know the answer, but I mean, it's a struggle to try to figure this out. And right now, everything we do is in the string language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, high level of abstraction here, because that's where I tend to play. But
it's great though, because I think we need to be well versed in it and to be able to talk in this and to translate it into something that makes sense. So I think, because it is abstract, but I think it's needed.
I think one of the things I think that we can make assumptions on what we think is more difficult or more painful or harder for people, without actually listening to them and asking them what they think is. So we've mentioned this, that sexual exploitation is a big thing, but actually, if you're somebody in extreme poverty in a very difficult context, what are the real problems for people? We may be focusing all our energy on sexual exploitation, when actually it may be something else that we should be focusing on.
I'm doing this in order to survive.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And for them, that's, and I think, even with, in the research we did in Poi Pet, Jarrett, where you had the way that the boys interpreted their experience of exploitation was very different than what the way that the girls experienced, the way the girls described it.
What is the key danger for boys who cross the border for work, and what is the key danger for girls? And girls believed that the key danger was being raped for girls, and getting hit by cars for boys. Boys believed that it was getting hit by cars for boys and getting raped for girls. So they both believed the same thing. However, boys were 7 times more likely to discourse, 4 or 7, I can't remember which study that was, but exponentially more likely to disclose experiencing sexual abuse and exploitation. And so a lot of even the boys who said that, yes, I've been raped, says, no, it doesn't happen to boys. But it does happen to girls. And boys are just at risk of physical violence, getting hit, punched, things like that. So how our preconception of our gender can make whole areas completely invisible to us, even if we've experienced it ourselves. And we found that really interesting in that study.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that speaks to, what society tells us our experience should be, and then molding our experience into what is expected. So, yeah. I did want to open it, just as we're getting a little bit closer to the end of time, if any of the individuals we haven't heard from yet, if you have any thoughts or questions, comments about any of this, just want to give other individuals a time to jump in. If not, no worries. But
I think it's really interesting because none of this is rocket science, but it can look like rocket science if your perspective is from someone, who's working with the top down, right? But when you're looking at from the perspective of people with experience, it couldn't be more simple, a lot, because it makes sense when you have their perspective. Yeah. Sorry.
And I think if CEOs, if people who ran programs, if governmental entities just heard the discussion, that would inform, I don't know, this is critical information. And yeah, Jared, you're right. I mean, not only some of the people on the ground, but some of the people that have been doing this for years, like us. It's like, like we're agreeing, but we're kind of preaching to the choir. So just having, just people with influence, maybe having the access to this kind of information would be awesome.
And so I got permission to air this critical discussion on the Emancipation Nation podcast because I think Jared is right. It's not rocket science. If you are someone that sits in a position where you are continually trying to learn the other perspective, that you practice humility and that you honor other people's realities, then this discussion is quite simple. It's something that you've already been struggling with as you work with people who are different than you, maybe ethnically different, maybe their histories are different, maybe their gender is different, maybe their nationality is different. You've already grappled with this. You've been grappling with it. It is a struggle of yours. It is something you take into consideration as you work with people who are even similar to you, but maybe have different histories. So if you are someone that sort of blindly has gone through life thinking, well, everybody's doing fine, everybody's equal to me, I don't see color, this is going to be a very eye-opening discussion to you. So and I think it's a way of allowing you to peer in or peek in to discussions among scholars around the world. These are the things that we grapple with as we attempt to create knowledge, right? So this group, we have these dialogues about monthly or so with scholars from all over the world. And we do this through our Global Association of Human Trafficking Scholars. So I want to make sure you know what that is. Actually, we shorten it to GAHTS, GAHTS.com. So you can go to GAHTS.com and you can learn more about our international partnerships to create knowledge and to further the knowledge base. And who you've been listening to is Jared Davis and Dr. Glenn Miles. So the mission of GATS is to respond to human trafficking by moving the knowledge base forward. And of course, once you create knowledge, it trickles down to policymakers and they use it to create laws. It trickles down to practitioners and agencies, social service, criminal justice, healthcare agencies, and so on. And they build practice models based on that. And it can drive the paradigm. That is the way people see things. It controls the narrative in terms of how people look at the issue, how people look at survivors or people with lived experience or those types of things. So GATS is a very important organization in my mind. So if you are a researcher in this field, or a journalist, or a practitioner, or a survivor, or you're just looking to learn more about the multidisciplinary fields of anti-human trafficking work, consider joining us. You can join at the senior research scholar level. That is $120 a year, and we use that information to keep GATS going. You can become a research scholar. You can become a developing scholar for $60 a year, or you can become an advocate for free and just be able to get our newsletter, be able to get access. And I think one of the amazing things that we offer is access to the Journal of Human Trafficking. And that is one of the first peer-reviewed journals where you can find research articles on human trafficking and ways that we are advancing the knowledge base. So this has been a very scholarly, kind of intellectual, kind of abstract discussion, but certainly has very practical implications. So I wanted to give you a window into some of the discussions that we have, because as we move the knowledge base forward, like I said, it shapes the way people think about the issue. And the fight continues. Let's not just do something, let's do the best thing. If you like this episode of Emancipation Nation, please subscribe and I'll send you the weekly podcast. Until then, the fight continues.